Thank you.
Not exactly a man who needs any introduction, but I've been asked to introduce, so let me just say this. Beth Ritchie in Chicago, in her important book, Arrested Justice, about black women, violence, and what she calls America's prison nation, talks about the fact that it's not just the person behind bars who feels the effects of what she calls the carceral state. We've been talking here about the civil versus the surveillance state. And I think we can say that Julian Assange is a man who lives at the intersection of those two phenomena, the carceral state and the surveillance state. And I want to start by welcoming you, Julian, to this crowd of friends. Let me assure you, as far as we know, most of us here are friends.
I'm sure, as Malcolm X said, there's one or two enemies in the audience.
Yes, indeed. And we want to invite you to speak, if we start for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. I'm sure the audience here are very interested to hear any developments, about the developments in your case, in the Swedish case, about your impressions or your response to the British court's decision yesterday, basically approving intrusion into our lives. And I'd be curious to know your take on where you think our civilization is, so-called. All that for starters. Thanks.
So that's the opening gambit, is it, for the first start of the questions?
Yes. Yes.
That'll take about 10 hours, I think.
That's good. We're good for that.
Well, before I try and remember what those questions were, I thought it might be time for some self-criticism. It's an interesting sign of the times that this conference happened at all, and I think a reasonably positive one, for which Governor McFadden is, of course, chiefly responsible, but also goldsmiths. It's interesting to see a London, I won't use the word establishment, but a long-lived London organization getting behind this, and also, of course, Logan for funding it. So I think that is something to recognize, that the development that is encapsulated by the people in this audience has tendrils that are not just isolated to a small group, but rather spread out across the world, as we've seen with a variety of speakers, but also into different forms of minor establishments, at least here in the United Kingdom. First of all, I have been following bits and pieces of the conference. And, of course, at something like this, I always want to rail against the perversion of what has become, or perhaps what always was, the media. And its corruption and its role in producing wars and many inequalities. But John Peel just said that so well. I have no need to touch the subject at all, although I'm sure we'll come back a little bit. And similarly, Jake and our last speaker have gone into some of the technical details in a really excellent fashion. So I'll try and avoid most of those. But let's look about who is probably not in this audience. And I'm interested to see what we can make of the most persecuted members of our society and who we might think they are. So we know for sure there's one group that is not in this audience, and that is prisoners. And prisoners are the most persecuted, the most unrepresented group in society, because they cannot speak, they do not have access, as we all love to talk about, social media. They don't have access in an output sense to any media at all. But there's another group that could be here that probably isn't. I'm interested in how many Muslim journalists are in the audience. Can you raise your hands? We have one, I think. Is that right?
2, 3. Not enough.
Okay, so well, that's pleasing to see that there's at least one. But it is, in fact, in this country, in England, and in Western Europe more broadly, Muslims are the most persecuted group. And we've all spoken about, this conference has heard a lot about the mass surveillance institution that has developed, the transnational mass surveillance state that has developed in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. But in England, it is also coupled with something called Protect, which is a broad spectrum effort to recreate the equivalent of the Stasi here in this country, compelling doctors and nurses to become informers, providing incentives at educational institutions for informers, creating mechanisms for different state agencies to work together and to create a connection between different institutions here in the UK to inform and work out how to best spy on the Muslim population in this country. Now, white people who are not Muslims don't have too much sympathy with what is happening to the Muslim population. And there's an obvious reason for that, because it is within the Muslim population that, yes, that there are Islamic extremists who commit acts of terrorism. But they are simply within the Muslim population, just as we are within the white population, or within the broader Anglo-Saxon population. And what is done to that Muslim population is a travesty for the human population, just in absolute terms. But if we think about our own self-interests, those of us not Muslims, soon enough, that will come to bite us, and in fact has. For example, the EU extradition warrant, which extradites people without them even being charged, which is the technical mechanism which has kept me detained without charge in this country for 4 years, came about on the back of 9/11, saying that that would be the mechanism that you could use to extradite people quickly in Europe without even bothering to charge them or to present any evidence. And did you all complain about that at the time that it was proposed? Well, probably not, because most people thought that is something that would just affect a portion of the Muslim population in this country. And this goes back to an old statement, which is valid today as it ever was, which is injustice anywhere is injustice soon enough everywhere. And if we allow seeds of injustice to grow in one part of the population, soon enough they'll be used to attack the rest. And I'd like you to do a thought experiment. With the mass surveillance state that has developed, but has in fact been developing since the 1950s, imagine for a moment if there was no Islamic extremism, and if there was no, say, economic competition from oil corporations like Petrobras in Brazil. Do you think that that mass surveillance state would just wind down? I don't think it will. I think organizations like that, once constructed, fight for their own existence. They fight for their own power as an institution. And there's always someone who is the most extreme. Even if you throw a party with your 20 best friends, there's always someone who is the most irritating and the most annoying, the person who is least sympathetic to your interests, even though they may be sympathetic compared to the rest of the world. Similarly here, even in this room, there is someone who is least sympathetic, even though we think that they are broadly aligned. And it is that person who can be picked on by those people who say that they are protecting you. And that business of taking individuals and positing them as threats is called securitization. And it is securitization which has allowed the National Security Agency, the CIA, and many similar institutions to grow almost unchecked. If we go back to the intervention in Libya in 2011, we couldn't say that Libya posed an extreme threat to the world. It doesn't seem that Libya posed any significant, in fact, any at all, threat to NATO countries or to the West more broadly. And yet the CIA became heavily involved in Libya, as did the NSA, as did GCHQ, as did MI6, and as did the French intelligence services. And yes, part of that was about pressure for expansionist activities to grab hold of Libya's oil, in fact revealed in secret deals between the Libyan opposition and the French government for France. But I look at it another way, which is understanding the basis of institutional existence. What is the purpose of the National Security Agency? What is the purpose of the Central Intelligence Agency? They have a purpose, which is to maximize their own power. That's it. That is their purpose. And to achieve that purpose, they need resources and political support. And so they try and shake down those people who have resources and who have political support. And they do it in two ways. One, by saying to the establishment, we can protect you. There are people who are after you. There is a risk, and we can protect you from that risk. And if you don't fund us, if you don't give us money and political support, there is a risk you, your friends, and your children may die. There is a risk that your assets in different countries may be stolen from you. And the other is to appeal to greed and ambition, that there are new assets that you can acquire, there are new allies that you can acquire, an expansionist ideal. So that, broadly speaking, is the business of securitization and empire. And the National Security Agency, in justifying its own existence, as does the Central Intelligence Agency, appeal to those two factors, securitization and empire, or expansion. And if we did not have a Muslim extremist threat, those organizations won't go away. They will simply roll over to target the person who is the next most annoying to those who are able to garnish tax funds or otherwise provide them with political economic support. And I think the case of Libya is an example where we see, yes, there was the empirical trend, the desire to go after Libya's resources. And yes, Libya and Colonel Gaddafi have been an ideological irritant to Western powers for some 30 years, but nothing significant. But the CIA and the Air Force and special services had to justify their own existence. Have to justify their own existence every month. They have to be busy doing something all the time. So I think we should just recognize that in relation to what is normally used as the excuse for these agencies to violate laws, or to expand laws to their liking, and to garnish resources. That as soon as one element disappears, the attacks on another one will start. Okay. The next point of self-criticism. We have, during this conference, there's been a lot of talk about how powerful the National Security Agency is, and GCHQ and so on, how sophisticated their technology is, how dangerous it is across space, how dangerous it is to every single type of person, how dangerous it is across time. And part of what is going on there, it is correct to assess and analyze these institutions. But part of what is going on is that we, people like me and Jacob Appelbaum, we are securitizing Western foreign policy and Western intelligence agencies. We are saying, support us, because these organizations are a threat to you. They're a threat to the nature of society. And yes, it is true that they are a threat, but nonetheless, in order to encourage people to understand what we see, we are telling you all the different ways in which they're dangerous and fearful objects. And in some ways, that is doing their work for them. It is making people in this audience paranoid and scared and thinking that they have an incredibly high wall of understanding to climb before they can do anything meaningful. And a few years ago, I worked on a collection of US counterinsurgency policy manuals, secret policy manuals, and also from the United Kingdom and India and a couple of other countries. But looking at the most important US manual on what is called unconventional warfare, it spoke about the use of secrecy by what it called insurgent groups, for example, such as the IRA. And that one of the techniques of suppressing insurgencies is to instill paranoia and fear into an insurgent group, because the reduction in communications efficienty in that group paralyzes it and slows it down, and it ceases to become an effective fighting force when it does so. Now, there are ways of dealing with this which are known in insurgency theory for insurgents. One, of course, is to assess the true risks and opportunities of the situation, and to never speak about risks without speaking about the balance in opportunity. And the other, which is an approach taken by the IRA and Sinn Féin, is to compartmentalize those sections of a resistance or an insurgency, or we might just say society, which need to be in the business of secrecy, concealing plans and intentions, and those parts which can take advantage of the efficiencies of openness. And that broadly corresponds to the IRA Sinn Féin split. A political organization with political defenses and a paramilitary organization with secrecy as one of its defenses. So let us not think that the only way to be effective is to simply be secretive. We must balance the opportunities with the risks, but also understand that political defense and the speed of openness is another way of getting things done. When an organization wants to, organizations like the National Security Agency, in surveilling others, what is the sort of the practical purpose? I've spoken about what the institutional purpose is, but what is the practical purpose? The practical purpose is to be able to make predictions, and through those predictions, either modify the behavior of others, or to outmaneuver those behaviors. Whether that's in relation to an oil bid, ExxonMobil competing against Brazil's Petrobras or another non-Five Eyes oil company, or whether that is killing someone with a drone who they perceive in Afghanistan or Pakistan is about to act against the interests of a US ally or the United States directly. secrecy slows an organization down. And slowing an organization down means there's greater time to prepare a response. And in my work, of course, I have used both extensive secrecy, but also speed when it is required, and openness when we can use it. And I give you an example which infuriates my staff, but it is, if you perceive that your communications or discussions or plans or some aspect of them may be known to an adversary who may attempt to check your decisions once made, then the time between decision and action should be extremely short. And the best way to make sure that it's extremely short is that you do not keep a plan secret, which you intend to carry out, but rather you have several different plans, and you're not sure which one you're going to use. And then when particular factors come into play, you reassess the situation, and then suddenly you decide on which plan you're going to carry out, and you carry it out. And you keep this decision-action loop as short as possible. And this is a technique that I used, for example, when I flew into the United States in early April 2010 to present collateral murder within the US. Even though at that time I had already acquired all the US State Department cables, and there was a risk that that was known to the United States and a lot of other material as well. And of course, we had been publishing various things back since 2007. But it was my understanding that by making that plan quickly, by preparing for that plan to some degree in secret in Iceland, and by having a political defense, which was presenting that material at the National Press Club, which was expecting me and which was advertised, that the large organization, the Pentagon and Central Intelligence Agency as large bureaucratic organizations which would need political clearance to launch an attack on me in the US Press Club, would simply move too slowly. Whereas if that plan had taken a month to carry out, the ability for those agencies to observe, understand, acquire clearances and the necessary resources to deploy in order to act against me would take too long. Similarly, when we were involved in exfiltrating Edward Snowden from Hong Kong to a place of asylum and conducting all the necessary logistical and diplomatic arrangements for that, we proceeded, yes, with great secrecy in our communications. On the other hand, also very quickly, and understanding that it was this speed of action as a small group compared to a very large bureaucratic concern like the National Security Agency that gave us an edge. And I think that is something to be optimistic about, that while the technology, in theory, that the National Security Agency has, can, yes, is being used to surveil everyone's internet communications. The ability of those organizations to understand what they are seeing, create a plan of action, get the necessary political clearances to employ that plan if you have a political defense, and to do it without cocking it up is actually pretty low. In some ways, the bigger and more secretive these organizations get, the more incompetent and useless they become. And I was heartened to hear Cy Hirsch speaking on just how useless the National Security Agency is as an effective organization. In the debates about Edward Snowden's revelations and the 215 US domestic call data acquisition program, the collection of all US call records in the United States. Let's remember that finally it came out that the National Security Agency, with that program over the course of almost 8 years, had stopped or had possibly stopped what they said was one terrorist plot. Just one. That's a reality that there is Islamic extremism. It's a reality that there are all sorts of terrorist plots, most of them extremely mundane or made or produced by jokes or set up by informers. But really 300 million people in the United States over that period of time, all sorts of people. And there was just one, or not even half a terrorist plot that the United States, the US National Security Agency was able to stop, despite this mass global surveillance system, which has now penetrated 70% of all mobile telephone networks, where every single one of you is a subject of it because you have been using Google or various aspects of the internet. So I find that something extremely hopeful. We should understand that while we are dealing with technology that in some senses seems like it is from another world, and that it encapsulates most of the world, on the other hand, we are also dealing with the institutions of human beings and secrecy. And an institution of human beings that exists in secret is an incompetent and corrupt organization, and increasingly corrupt. If you look at what's happening in the US military procurement sector or intelligence procurement sector, what happened to General Alexander as soon as he finished his tenure as National Security Agency chief? Well, of course, he started up a company, a consulting company, to use his connections with the National Security Agency, i.e. to not be part of an open market, but to use insider connection. And that happens across the board. And it has increased tremendously from 10 National Security Agency contractors about 13 years ago to more than 1,000 now. So a big, secretive, bureaucratic, in some ways Soviet-style state, the national security state, a state within a state that exists in the Western Anglo-Saxon alliance, is also a corrupt, dilapidated, incompetent, bureaucratic state. So I think we should go from here with that notion that while we have a very well-resourced opponent, we also have an opponent that is in many respects absolutely hopeless, and hopeless in many of the same ways that the large military apparatus in the Soviet Union shortly before its fall was also hopeless.
I think you brilliantly covered the civilization question. Check. I would love to hear two things. One, your response to the court decision yesterday, and two, a little bit more about this question of opportunity in this moment. What are really the stakes for us in a spirit of opportunity and possibility right now?
In relation to the court decision yesterday, well, I haven't read the decision. I know a little bit about the case. But it's no surprise here in the United Kingdom, I despair really about the United Kingdom as a society. The system here is, at a social level, extremely well sewn up. And that's why you see, for example, the former chief of Scotland Yard's crowd policing going to Bahrain to try and suppress the Shiite opposition in Bahrain. It is a state here where I often joke that if you were to pull the cross from people's backs here, they would instantly grab it and strap it to themselves once again because they could not stand the cool air on their neck. Yeah, I despair about the UK. I'm not from the UK. I find it extremely alien to see that integration in the class system. On the other hand, perhaps there are elements outside of London that you can work with. At least, not everyone in this lecture hall is, not everyone here is from outside the UK. There are some people here that are from the UK, although I do notice that Gavin McFadden, the central organising force, is an American, not someone from the UK, and I rather suspect that that's not a coincidence. Similarly, the funder of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, why she has lived for many years in the UK, is South African in origin. And why is that? It's because the people who have ability here in the UK and who are born in the UK pretty much get sucked into a very plastic class system. By plastic, I mean flexible and adaptable. And that's why the United Kingdom is one of the preferred homes of oligarchs from around the world, because of that plasticity, and because the UK is set up for a class system where you can achieve significant comfort with a significant amount of money or power, that the doors will open for you and envelop you and pull you in. But the foreigners without significant amounts of power or money, but do have significant amounts of talent, like Gavin, were not sucked in to that class system as cashed up interlopers or as people who were born into some part of it.
You're making me feel good about leaving 30 years ago. Any questions from the audience? Let's start at the very, very back. Poor Caroline has to run all the way to the top row here.
The audience have to stay seated all the time. Where are you?
Two other hands. Let's see two other hands. Okay. Carol, keep them up for a second and she'll know where to come.
I'd just like to say
in the middle
I've experienced this phenomenon personally. It's very interesting. So being trapped in the United Kingdom by the Guardian newspaper, which is why I was here, I arrived on the scene, if you like, and was extremely famous for being persecuted, but nonetheless extremely famous. And a whole lot of people came knocking at my door. And I had the impression from, the establishment, and I had the impression of sort of being patted on the head and going, well done, you created a really big fuss. Now, come and, see the dining room. And you can have a seat at the table, or rather maybe the end of the table. And then when sort of spoken to about that, there was a sort of dawning look of horror on the faces of these types when they understood I actually believed all that, that I actually believed in what I was doing. And a sort of look of disgust. It's like, you're not one of those, are you? You're not one of, who actually believes what they say to the public.
Okay, here's a question for you, Julian. Sylvia.
Hi. Yeah, no, you're right about the class system. We've got the strongest structure, but you can move down it pretty easily. But yeah, also I want to thank you for recognizing Goldsmiths and not calling it an institution. I just really want to know what you think about what quantum computers are going to do to cryptography.
Can you say that again? You're a bit soft.
What are quantum computers going to do to cryptography? Are you worried about them?
Quantum computers.
Yeah.
What they'll do to cryptography.
What about quantum computers? Okay, very interesting.
All the equations at once, right?
Quantum computers was one of the reasons that I started doing this business, because I was involved with the Melbourne University physics department, and part of that department was a quantum computation research, and that department's some of that department's quantum computation research conferences were funded by the National Security Agency, and a number of other things. But so they've been involved in looking at that business for a long time. One of the benefits, I suppose, of the Snowden revelations, although those people who've been following it closely with non-classified sources came to much the same conclusion, is that the National Security Agency doesn't yet have a big quantum computer system. And the National Security Agency is not significantly advanced in physics compared to academic physics. And that's not a big surprise. As a physicist, do you really want to work for a secretive bureaucratic organization like that? You might see the 60 Minutes episode that General Alexander did, showing inside the National Security Agency for the first time. What a horrible place. It looked like that building was constructed in the 1980s. It has extremely nasty floor tiles, low ceilings, and no open windows. Can you imagine working in something like that? But this is not a place where those people who have either opportunity or morality would choose to work. And so they don't have the same edge that they might have had, for example, in the Cold War, when the ideological alliances were a bit better and the proportionate funding was also better. But the threat of quantum computation is going back in time and decrypting materials in 10 years' time that you're making now. That's the real threat of quantum computation. And I think that is a threat. The National Security Agency's policies have it recording all encrypted telecommunications permanently. They don't throw that away. If you make a communication which is encrypted, they keep it. And the reason that they keep it is because there may be some cryptographic breakthrough later on that will destroy that cryptographic system, or they may get hold of your keys that you use to make the message. Use something called forward secrecy, which is implemented in some of the better protocols like OTR. That going back in time factor cannot be done. But decrypting public key cryptography systems by quantum computers 10 years in the future, but going back in time to what you're doing now, yes, that's a possibility. It'll be interesting to think whether that creates so many opportunities in terms of decrypting existing telecommunications that what you are doing now is a priority or not. I think what you're doing now will not be a priority in 10 years' time, but what you're doing in 10 years' time might be of interest, and what you were doing now might be something that could be used to blackmail you in 10 years' time. And the way to defend against it, well, first of all, there are very few, almost no one uses computer telecommunications in a way which is secure against a targeted attack by the GCHQ or NSA. Very, very few people. I suspect almost no one in this audience. It takes a lot of work to do. It's not easy. And for that reason, I think are the best forms of security, yes, you've got to have this layer of, you've got to have a layer of encryption in order to, to not be subject to bulk surveillance, which is easy. You've got to make them work for it. But then within that layer, you need to carry out human OPSEC, which has been, communicating using shared information, code words, and acting quickly, and being circumspect in your language, and using these forms of communication, which are resistant to a break in cryptography. And also constructing the appropriate political defenses to protect you politically. And if you look at, say, the offshore sector is all about political defense. The reason the offshore sector is complicated is it's hiding its evasion from the taxman by using some additional layers of complexity which make additional work. And as a result, it's simply more efficient for the tax office to go after others where there's not that extra work that is required.
Take another question.
We can do that as well. I mean, we can make it so that there's more profit per dollar spent for those institutions in going after Islamic extremists than there is in going after us. But if the Islamic extremists disappeared, then you're fucked.
I was hoping you were going to say that in 10 years hence we would have toppled this corrupt, corroded, and out-of-date society through our united action. Next question.
Hi. It's a bit long question, okay? So I used to love technology, and I followed the R&D in new inventions and new technology, and it's only about a couple of years ago that I realized that this was really dangerous, and it was being used in a really dangerous way among also the Muslim community. So with this growth in innovation and technology that was forever around in these private companies, there were 4 areas that were getting a lot of funding. And this was the kind of what became, our database, our data, and our surveillance. The other one was robotics, which has become our drones. And there's 2 more, which I'm thinking, what did they do with those 2? Because they misused this fantastic, exciting stuff that could have been beautiful. Then what did they do to these other 2? And I wondered if you knew anything about it. So the other 2 that I kind of began to follow was it was all about signaling, neurological signaling, behavioral, and it was about really tapping into the way our brains work. The other one was the medical sciences, and it was the biomedical aspect of our life, and it went all the way down to our DNA. I know that the electronic patient record systems have been rolled out around the world, but I also now know that they're being privatized, and they're being moved to research departments which also do research on military weaponry.
All right.
So I wanted to know if you knew anything about that.
I didn't hear any of that.
Okay. So if we know what they did with...
Something about patient records and weapons.
If we know what they did with surveillance technology and robotics technology, what did they do with neurological research and electronic records, biomedical technology, all of which have been areas of tremendous investment?
Right. There's a convergence. The convergence is very concerning, actually. So in Japan, 2 years ago, a Japanese biotech company announced it had a unit to take a sweat swab and within half a second do a match against 35 million DNA profiles. So within a couple of years, we're going to see a small sniffer, a machine with a fan that draws in air that takes sweat samples as you go through the airport. Similarly, there's new new devices to look at the spectrum of light that is emitted by human beings, and to try and create signatures, because each person has different DNA, and the different DNA produces different proteins and enzymes, and those different proteins and enzymes operate at different speeds, and so as a result they release different photons in different ratios, and from that you can create a signature. So this fast signatures of human beings is something that is coming, not just through fast signatures of human beings, relatively non-invasive. And once that happens, it'll be everywhere. You know, it'll be on your ATM machine, and it'll be at passport control and so on. When we combine this with mass surveillance that is occurring through the state sector and through the private sector in organizations like Google, we enter into a system that has never existed before, which is that as soon as you are born, you have a relationship with not just your local town, not just your parents, not even just one nation, but you have a relationship with the major power factions of the entire world. And you are then encapsulated in your path through your personal history by that relationship. Now, if we think about what that means, well, I think it means a state that cannot be escaped from, an international society that cannot be escaped from, there being no place for individuals outside that. And therefore, in the relationships between individuals, the personal aspect of their relationship is something that has to be encoded between each other, to have a society within society, a hidden language. And you can see that use of hidden languages in very cloistered and confined societies, conformist societies. And no doubt something like that is happening in North Korea. It happens in small island societies where there's no ability to escape the social surveillance. It happened at various times in the Soviet Union. And to some degree, it happens in conformist countries like Sweden, which are very homogenous and have a small elite, where people talk in a kind of code language, where you never criticize something, you just say it feels strange to speak those code words. On the other hand, what's the positive? Well, for someone of my temperament, there's no positive at all, I can assure you. But that will be a state which no one can escape. And therefore, we must all be part of it. We must be part of trying to manage the government and society, because there is no place outside.
Next question.
Thank you, Julian. It's Peter Bale here. You were greeted straight away here as a hero by this crowd. I wonder, though, whether you need to deal with or can deal with the sexual questions or the criminal case hanging over you in Sweden, or is that a conspiracy?
I couldn't quite hear the accent. Is that a London or a British or an Australian journalist?
It's a New Zealand person who's lived in London 30 years, and I love your view of the English class system, which I'm going to have to record at some point.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to think of the headlines that will come from this, so of course I have to be careful. Well, I wish people understood the details of what has gone on. The details are available, but it seems that no one wants to report the details. I have been detained without charge now for 4 years. I'm an innocent man, and what has occurred is very unfair and unjust. There's a growing realization of just how unfair and unjust it is. As a result, there have been legal changes in the United Kingdom this year to ban extradition without charge in this country. In Sweden, there has been a growing realization also. As a result, the Swedish court recently found that the prosecution in Sweden was in violation of their duty, that they should have come to interview me. They say that they want to extradite me for interview. They should have come to the United Kingdom, and that was wrong. In relation to the other details, you can read about them on justiceforassange.com, and I really encourage you to do so. It's actually extremely interesting that the details of that case, the details of what the women say in that case, namely that they never intended to file a complaint, that the police made it up. Why aren't those details reported here in the United Kingdom? It's incredible. That's a great story. Similarly, it's a great story that the FBI's informer, star informer against WikiLeaks, has been convicted in Iceland, has been put in jail in Iceland for fabricating messages from me, has been convicted of sexually assaulting a minor, and is on trial for the sexual assault of 11 other people, 11 other minors. Did you hear about that in the London press? Did you hear about how the FBI uses people like that in Europe? Did you hear about the criminal case that we filed against the FBI in Denmark that is on foot? Did you hear about the criminal case that we filed in Sweden against Swedish intelligence that is on foot? Did you hear about the criminal case that we filed against the US military in Germany? Did you hear about that? Did you hear about how the Department of Justice on the 19th of May submitted to US federal court that its proceedings against me and WikiLeaks are active, ongoing, and pending prosecution? Did you hear about that in London? No, you didn't hear about it. Why didn't you hear about it in London?
Another question. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Muna. Yes.
Put it right near your mouth.
Okay. I'm an Iraqi student in London doing journalism. I recently arrived, and soon enough I will be moving home. And I am lingering on your surprise when you said you were surprised that Goldsmith, that London University is hosting this event. And because I am an outsider to this culture, I'm curious to know why you were surprised, and any pearls of wisdom of what I should take home with me to Iraq and what I should dismiss from the UK, because I see that you're a little critical. Thank you.
I'm not, I didn't say I was surprised, not at all. I am heartened that Goldsmith has done something that is intellectually interesting. And is pushing the way forward academically, vigorously. Can I sum up London? I was a stranger to London 4 years ago. I think maybe Gavin, who's been here much longer, could better describe it. I can just say that, you know, when you meet people who wear, for example, signet rings to demonstrate the banner of their family and ostentatiously to display those things. I mean, as an Australian who comes from a society that is anti-class, it has some class system of its own, but it's insignificant compared to the United Kingdom. I mean, I just want to take a pair of pliers and cut that finger off. I just can't concentrate on the conversation. It's so alien to me. And I imagine also from people from the United States, maybe also from Germany. And what happened in World War II for many Western European countries, but especially Germany, is that there was occupation by Germany, let's put it this way, there was occupation by the Nazis. Now I can include Germany in my example. There was then occupation or liberation by the West, by the East, and for those eastern parts, then again by the West. And the result was a pressing the reset button on the class system in many of those countries, or at least seriously upsetting the class system. That didn't happen in the United Kingdom. Didn't happen in Sweden. And whereas relatively new settler countries like the United States and Australia, well, the wiping out of the Aborigines in Australia certainly pressed the reset button on their class system in a genocidal manner. But then the settlement spread quickly. And the sort of the growth in the population happened so quickly and spread out so quickly that there wasn't time for a class system, a proper class system to form. But as countries get older and older, a class system forms, and all the different ways of sucking up to classes that are above you or displaying class to those who are below you, or hiding your class at the right moment and concealing it at a different moment, dog whistling your class so you convey it to some to hear it and not to others. But I find it absolutely disgusting, frankly.
I don't think Julian would mind if I suggest you take home from here to Iraq our apologies. Next question.
Hi, Julian. Thanks so much for speaking to us. You said earlier that the Guardian newspaper...
Microphone to your mouth, right up there, yeah.
There you go. You said earlier that the Guardian newspaper had trapped you in the UK. Can you please elaborate? How did they trap you? Thank you. Oh, and I'm from the Guardian, so I'm the Muslim journalist from the Guardian.
Can this moderator repeat that question?
Well, the questioner is from The Guardian, and she wanted you to elaborate on your comment that it was The Guardian that trapped you here in the UK.
Sure. The Guardian was one of our partners. I've worked with various journalists at The Guardian since 2007. Our first front page produced by our material in The Guardian was in 2007. But I made an institutional mistake with The Guardian in 2010, which is instead of dealing with individual journalists, I dealt with The Guardian as an institution. And institutions have their own logic. That doesn't include, for example, morality. That does include morality. And I came here to the United Kingdom to assist The Guardian in understanding the Iraq war logs, and then finally in relation to the cables. Now, my calculus was this. In the United Kingdom is part of the Five Eyes Alliance. I'm an Australian citizen. Regardless of what else might happen, I would not be kidnapped from the United Kingdom by US services. There was a lot of talk in the US press about kidnapping our staff. There's even a bill was placed before Congress to declare our staff enemy combatants and myself to be kidnapped at will or to be killed at will by the US military. I knew that would not happen in the United Kingdom. However, of course, there is the legal system, and things would progress through the legal system. And the legal system, like all legal systems, is susceptible to political and societal pressure. But I had so I thought, one newspaper, a decent-sized newspaper in the United Kingdom, in my corner in relation to this. And therefore, I was confident that the legal process, while it might take a while to proceed, that I would be victorious in that legal process, or at least have a significant chance in dragging out that process and being victorious in it. because not only the establishment's perspective in the matter would prevail. However, the Guardian newspaper, because of its perceived self-interest and the fear it was feeling, this is my observation, the fear it was feeling, the pressure it was feeling, decided to flip sides. Not only did it not become neutral, go from being positive to being neutral, it actively campaigned for my imprisonment and extradition. And part of that reason was because the Guardian broke all 3 points of its Cablegate contract with us. It smuggled all the cables to the New York Times, where we were trying to broker a deal with the Washington Post and the McClatchy Group. It smuggled all the cables to a Mossad contact at Haaretz secretly, all 251,000 cables to a Mossad contact at Haaretz. It similarly engaged in other strategic maneuvers to undermine and wrong-foot us in violation of its contract. It also put all 251,000 cables on an internet-connected computer, which was in violation of our contract. And it also engaged in a secret plan to start publishing without telling us before we were ready and before our other partners were ready to scoop us and wrong-foot us. Because of a variety of reasons, personal ambition and so on. But once the conflict started, the Guardian became worried about us suing them and worried about the legal situation and the individuals concerned. For example, David Lee, the brother-in-law of Alan Rusbridger. David Lee has subsequently, fortunately, retired, but he was not someone that could be knocked off from the Guardian because of his personal relationship with Alan Rusbridger, his familial relationship with Alan Rusbridger. So the lesson I learned from this was that never become someone's victim. Never let someone fuck you over, and never let them know that they have betrayed you. In this case, in a contractual sense. David Lee even wrote the decryption password to all 251,000 cables and put it in the Guardian book, which the Guardian still sells. Never allow someone to do that. And the reason is simple, because someone who perceives that they have engaged in an act of moral criminality towards you, then is very highly motivated to do everything possible to destroy you before natural justice can be engaged. So if someone, basically, you can sum it up, murderers will murder to cover up murder. And having murdered once will murder again. And having murdered twice will murder 3 times, and so on. There's greater and greater motivation to do the wrong thing when someone has already done the wrong thing, to cover up the previous position. And in this particular case, I, the WikiLeaks, were the moral witnesses to the immoral and illegal in terms of contract law, what the Guardian did, and those key figures in the Guardian. So in order to prevent a lawsuit, in order to prevent a reputational assault, the Guardian did everything possible to have me imprisoned and extradited, and to undermine the value, the credibility of my testimony on what the Guardian had done. Now, there's many fine people in the Guardian, many fine journalists, journalists that have not succumbed or didn't succumb at the time to those institutional pressures. But nonetheless, there were key figures like David Lee, the brother-in-law of the editor, who was obsessed in pushing this line. He is fortunately gone now. I worked with Alan Rusbridger on something else, but you know, it's one of these things where a leadership position might change a bit, but you still have this horrible middle layer of stucks in an institution that is sucking up to what they perceive the leadership's desires to be. So we still get these occasional nasty, ridiculous, quite frankly, stories coming out of the Guardian in order to preserve what they think as their reputation in this inter-organizational reputational conflict.
That's it for questions. I want to just end with remarking that you are spending your third Christmas coming up under no charges, interned without trial, they call it in Northern Ireland. What do you want for Christmas?
What about it?
No, what do you want for Christmas?
Well, I have a seven-story chimney. Connecting one of the rooms. We have explored it, you know, occasionally one hears things from that chimney, so we have explored it to make sure something is not being lured down. What do I want? I think what I want is not especially important. I think the goal must be and has always been education. And that has always been the enemy of mankind, and always been the enemy of individuals, is when people are ignorant and uninformed, they act in a stupid way that often harms all of us. It harms their interests, it harms your interest. It means that we cannot be our best as a group of individuals or as a society. So my wish for Christmas is that people are educated. I think that probably won't fit down the chimney, but you never know.
All right, we'll see what we can do. Thank you so much, Julian Assange.
Thanks.
Drinks outside, everybody, and free snacks. And big data poetry. Don't miss it.